I'd like to take a moment to introduce our esteemed panel. First, we have Lloryn Hubbard. Lloryn is the Director of Patient Diversity at Pharmaceutical Product Development, PPD, which is a part of Thermo Fisher Scientific. She is an experienced clinical operations professional and leader in ensuring diverse populations are represented in clinical research. As head of patient diversity at PPD, Lloryn has strategic oversight over the company's clinical trial health equity efforts and leads a team of specialists focused on optimizing drug development for patient safety and diversity. And also Ivy Kam, by background, is a pharmacist, a doctor of pharmacy. She's director of DEI Sciences at Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Office with Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. As Director of DEI Services at Regeneron, Ivy integrates her passion in science and health equity with 20-plus years of experience in clinical practice and in the biopharmaceutical industry. Ivy has served in various leadership positions in science and health equity in the past 15 years, notably serving as chair of the American Heart Association Chinese Community Cardiac Council and vice chair of the American Heart Association Western States Affiliate Asian Pacific Islander Task Force. Dr. Koen de Lombaert is a physician and co-founder of Study Pages, Yuzu Labs Public Benefit Corporation. Dr. Lombaert is a doctor of medicine from KU Leuven and holds an MBA from Johns Hopkins University. He's based in San Francisco, and he has been since 2014. Again, is the co-founder of Study Pages, a leading digital platform aimed at diminishing participation barriers and bolstering diversity within clinical research. My colleagues will also share additional information about their backgrounds. I'm really excited to start this conversation. As we heard earlier, there are many factors associated with why clinical trials currently does not represent all cultures and underrepresented populations. And today we're going to have a frank conversation about some of those reasons, which, again, the context was set earlier. My colleagues will provide their feedback and their thoughts, and also things that they have done across their careers to improve inclusion and diversity in clinical trials. So the way that we're going to facilitate this discussion is the panelists will answer a number of questions that I will ask them. After we've concluded with all of the questions, you will have an opportunity to come up to the mic. You see them on both sides of the room, and ask any questions that you might have and provide feedback. Thank you. All right, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
We're happy that you're here. So as we know, in December 2022, the OMB funding bill was enacted, and the FDA now mandates a diversity action plan for all phase 3 clinical trials related to drugs, biological products, and many medical devices. So with that in mind, I'd like to sort of ask the first question, and would really appreciate all of you sort of chiming in. Would you share your perspective on the FDA guidance for clinical trials diversity and health equity and how they address structural racism and implicit bias?
I can start. So I definitely think it's a step in the right direction. Do I believe that it is actually impacting implicit bias? No. I do think that it is a stepping stone to be able to collect the data that can highlight that there is possibly, we all know that there is, but implicit bias, and that there is disparity in what we are seeing in our clinical trials. I definitely think that we are currently at a stage where we have a lot of challenges being able to not only collect the data, but leverage the data appropriately to make impactful change in how we're organizing our clinical trials moving forward. So I definitely think it's a step in the right direction. I think that I'm really looking forward to the public workshops. I'm really looking forward to the feedback that we get with the second year when they're actually going to pull this data from the diversity plans and the feedback. I think that would get us in a more of a place where we can actually identify if we're impacting disparity or implicit bias.
Thank you.
I would second that. I mean, that's great. It's a step in the first direction. I mean, implementing will take some time, and it will need a multi-pronged approach to actually, achieve that. But I mean, getting the stamp of or a push from a federal or a regulatory body is definitely a big impetus to start working on that. So
I can also add too that I think that this is, you mentioned push, and that's what triggered. There is a huge push now within the industry to make this a priority. There is a huge push to better understand what diversity looks like in trials. It is definitely been incentivized and pushed by this FDA guidance. It's been further incentivized by the mandate that went through Congress. So we see it way more frequently. On my side, I work at a CRO, clinical research organization. So we see it from all sponsors at all levels. Oftentimes, larger pharmaceutical companies, they have their own plans kind of all ready to go. But a lot of the smaller pharmaceutical companies that might have only a couple of phase 3 pipeline molecules, they are really struggling to really identify how to flesh out this diversity plan. So I can also add that. I think it's definitely pushing us as an industry to look sincerely at what diversity looks like in our clinical trials.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to echo everything that you guys have said. I think, the FDA guidance is definitely a first step. Your question is whether it directly addressed racism. It does not. It did not say thou shalt not be racist. But in order for us to follow the spirit of, really truly doing inclusive research, those are the subtexts that we need to address. And so I think that beyond checking boxes to say, hey, here's the FDA guidance, you do this, you do this, you do that, it's really trying to examine our own built-in structural bias, not just in the bigger healthcare ecosystem that a lot of speakers touched on earlier, but internally, what our own personal beliefs and biases are. And if you're a living person, you have a bias, right? Because you come from a certain perspective. And that's not the issue. The issue is, being able to recognize that and interpret that as you're making decisions, for yourself in a group setting. How do you take all of those biases in consideration and then implement them, as you try to do more inclusive clinical trials as outlined by the FDA guidance. So I think that is the way that we have to look at it. Is the guidance is coming, right? It's pushing us to do things, but then it's the mindset that we also have to address before we can actually do the right things that follow the spirit of the guidance.
Mindset shift.
Yeah. Thank you for your responses. I think it raises a number of issues. What are some of those specific challenges beyond what you have already mentioned? And what might we do to overcome the top barriers to implementing these new guidelines?
I'll start again. So I think that's a very heavy question because it's so multifaceted. I think that many of the lecturers that we saw this morning identified a ton of the barriers, right? We acknowledge that we know what the barriers are. Now we're trying to figure out how to actually tackle these barriers, how to do something about these barriers. And it's different with each indication, it's different with each sponsor, it's different with each patient population. So we're really trying to take these lessons learned from MRCT specifically. I feel like we've all kind of garnered, they're like the Bible right now for us. Take these lessons learned and chop them down. Chop them down isn't the right word, but bring them down to like study by study, case by case, what can we do? We work really specifically at site level. Sites face a number of challenges besides just enrollment, right? They're facing resource challenges, financial challenges, all of those things that impact how they can adequately do clinical trials or do them successfully. We have to tackle those things first and identify how we can support sites, how we can support physicians, patients, their site staff, before we even get to the piece of enrollment and diverse enrollment at that. Oftentimes these sites are doing a lot of the community engagement, the community recruitment that we know is the base for structuring trust with the patients and can move them into clinical trials. They're doing that out of their own pocket oftentimes. So how do we eliminate that cost from sites so that they can focus on actually getting more patients into the study using these community resources and community relationships that they've already built? I think we also have to think about just overall burden on not only sites, but the patients, and really investing into clinical trials in that way. I think it's one thing to talk about and acknowledge the barriers. I think it's another thing to implement it into your strategy for your program, right? So if we're thinking at a study level, I think we're already behind. I think we have to think about it before the study even gets started, before the study's even thought about, right? We're thinking programmatic level so that these budget impacts, you think about translations, you think about different site budgets, you think about all these things that are, sorry, I'm in the weeds, guys, because I deal with this every day, but realistically what we're running into, the main challenges that we're running into is that study teams don't have the budgets to implement these tactics because it's too late in the game. So we're trying to really vocalize that we need to think about these things much sooner. I'm gonna stop.
But I would like to build on that because you touched on some of those points that are so important that, you know, we talked about, and all the speakers, you know, really alluded to some of those things that you're saying. Why it's so important to engage the community, do that upfront, do that early. All that take resources and time. You know, we're talking about building trust, you know, and relationships in the underserved community. A lot of the times, you know, we think of studies and trials as transactions, you know, one trial, one study, one budget. So now we need to go into the Black community to do this. Now we need to go into the Hispanic community to do that. The patients can smell you and your disingenuous intent if you come in and say, I need to build a relationship with you. Well, because I need you in this and this and this trial. So it takes time. And it takes, you know, a lot of thought about how do you build these relationships, you know, even when you don't need them. You don't need them for something right now. So how do you change the mentality of, let's say, a company, and I work at Regeneron, we're doing something like that, but I can say that for, you know, all sponsors and partners doing research is, how do you change the mentality so that you understand why you need to be in the community, working with community partners, even before you need them for a particular trial? And that takes, you know, the resources that it takes. We all know that studies run on a budget, a tight timeline. You need to get there first. You know, you need to be there ahead of your competitors. So how do you help change the culture, like what I said earlier, the mindset and the culture that these investments are important to make. They're critical to make. If you want to bring your drug to all patients who could eventually use your drug, who can benefit from your drug. So it's changing that mindset that, you know, when you're allocating budget, you're not allocating budget to one study.
Yeah.
You're allocating budget to really change the landscape and the ecosystem of how you interact with underserved patient communities. And that's how you invest instead of just like add phase 3, you know, when you have enrollment numbers and you look at the numbers like, oh, they don't add up, let me do something about it. That's way too late. So that's what we're trying to change the mentality is allocating budget across different studies, you know, across even different programs so that we can have the ability to invest in something that may not come into fruition until maybe 5 years, 10 years later.
I want to challenge the notion a little bit about every study is different and things. I think it's every study team will say like, oh, our study is special, things like that. But still, if you look at it, it requires steps that can be generalized across all trials, right? And that ties a little bit into your point, like it's educating, then inviting people, screening, consenting, the whole thing. And we can improve on all these steps with across studies, right? So how fast can you respond? What channels can you use to respond? Does it only have to be like, you know, by phone or email? Can you also like do text messaging or different things and flexibility there? And really approach these problems like almost first principles, like what can we solve for a whole portfolio and tie that in and connect that with our community efforts and things like that. So.
Thank you. This is a very complex conversation. I think what we heard here is, the FDA guidelines and other guidelines such as that are broad strokes, but each of us within our respective organizations have had the opportunity to really create the fundamental steps to ensure that clinical trials are inclusive. And I think that's what we're hearing from our industry panelists today. What can each of us do within our respective organizations to translate those guidelines into actionable steps to ensure that we are being inclusive? We do a lot of work at Stanford looking at, my team does, looking at inclusivity in clinical trials, the intention for that. At the very beginning, before a protocol has gone through coverage analysis in the IRB, and we start having that conversation with those study teams up front. I think that's where it needs to begin, but even before that, when we're constructing the protocols for the study, when we're seeking funding, et cetera. So we have that opportunity. So thank you, and you said you're in the weeds. I think we need to be in the weeds here. This is where we have that opportunity. All right, so we have spent some wonderful time talking about FDA guidance, race and racism. We know that, to your point, Ivy, we can't change the hearts and minds of people, but we can influence that by putting standards and policies in place that we hold people accountable to within our organizations. So we're going to transition to clinical trials design. And I'd like to just throw this out to all of our panelists. What are some of the challenges in designing clinical trials to encourage participation from underrepresented populations? We heard that there are many barriers, many factors on both sides of sort of the stage with our patients, with communities, within our healthcare systems. How do we sort of improve this?
So I guess from the sponsor's perspective, when we think about designing a trial or even developing a compound for a specific indication, it really starts from before the compound even entered the clinic. In our labs, when we even have a compound that we think is about to go into the clinic, we have to start thinking about, the patient population that is, that the compound could be indicated for. So a couple of things that we have to think about is, I think a lot of speakers touch on the patient-centric approach to it, that, what is the experience of the patient? Who are these patients that are truly, experiencing these diseases? So building relationship with patient advocacy groups, community groups, and, doing the outreach, at that phase, even before we're doing clinical research, to get their insight. When we designed the trials. So one of the examples I had early on was I was involved in a muscle wasting compound early on in research. And so at that time, I was going to a research site and seeing how things are going. And I noticed that everyone has a stick that they have in the office. And they used to prop up the windows, prop open the doors. And I was like, I thought that was a stick that we're using to measure muscle strength. And it turned out that no one can use that because it's too hard, even for someone with normal muscle strength to use it. And so for patients, as a way to measure their improvement, no one can even use that even when they're getting treatment. So that stick become a window propping stick. And so these are the examples, and that's an extreme example, but these are the examples that I want to say is things that we can do better in terms of really understanding patient's perspective as we design the trial. So, the outcomes that we measure, the way we measure these outcomes are actually meaningful, to the patients that are being involved. Mm-hmm. So that's one. And another thing is, I know that we'll probably touch on that later too in terms of the demographic and disease epidemiologic data that we use, because the FDA is requiring us now to look at epidemiologic data, real-world data, as we build our study protocol so that we're truly understanding the diversity of the patient population that our development program is going into. However, the data that we take as gospel has flaws as well, right? Mm-hmm. Because by definition, epidemiologic data, real-world data comes from people who have had interactions with the healthcare system. Mm-hmm. How about patients who never had the opportunity to engage the healthcare system? Patients that are not diagnosed, patients that were not treated, they're not getting preventive measures, they don't show up, or they are represented in a skewed way. They present with much later stages of diseases because they never received the preventative care. So how do we take all this data? I mean, the data itself is great. We have to take that into account. But how do we also be mindful of the flaws and gaps in the data as we design our programs so that we're truly understanding the unmet needs in these patient populations when we design our trials? So those are the things that I think that we all have to be mindful of as we design our programs.
If I could piggyback on that a little bit, I think when you touched on like the patient journey, I think that the patient journeys that we're using as an industry are also very homogeneous. So being able to diversify what we're thinking about as a patient when we're developing our trials is really important. Also, oftentimes these patient journeys are very privileged. So we're not thinking about getting to work, missing work. We're not thinking about child care, elder care. We're not thinking about, distance to site. All of those things, they're not always incorporated into the patient journeys that we're leveraging to better assess the schedule of assessments in our studies. So that's one thing, and I lost the other one. Dang it.
It'll come back.
It'll come back.
Aren't trials becoming ever more complex and lengthy? Is there like, in the tech world, you would call it feature creep? So you keep adding secondary endpoints, adding an additional burden. So.
Yep.
I was wondering how the industry is thinking about that. Or
The creep.
Yeah.
I mean, and because everything is interesting from a scientific perspective, right? I want PK sample it this week. I want tissue sample it this week. I want X-ray for that week. So intellectually, it's very satisfying. But that is following the science. The traditional development mindset is, I want data. But then it's like switching the mindset to what if, we think about it from the patient's perspective. Like you said, how about the number of days that you have to miss work, childcare costs that you incur? I'm thinking about, going back to Oakland to pick up my kid after today.
Yep.
And, those are the things that, we as people, we're subjects, we're, researchers, we're all people. We have lives to deal with. So how do we make that make sense? And I think you mentioned like technologies, right? How can we incorporate that to make life easier for our patients? Are there ways that we can combine study visits so that it's easier for people to manage in the day? Are we thinking about how far away the lab is from the, the diagnostic test? Do they have to fast? Do they have to fast the whole entire day to get all those tests done? So those are the things that I think as, I would say this, as sponsors, we don't always think about that, or historically, we don't think of our subject as people with lives. And so I think that the mentality really has to change that. We're getting a study done, we're enrolling subjects, but how are people really managing their lives to participate in science that we want them to participate in a way that actually works for them?
I also, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, because you mentioned the endpoints and how they keep tagging on, I used to be on the sponsor side. And one thing that we did was we just added an exploratory endpoint around race ethnicity. Because it was like, well, if we're going to add all these endpoints, we might as well also add one around how we're collecting race ethnicity and make sure that it's somewhere in our database, in our data set, right? And it couldn't get pushed out because that means you have to push out these other exploratory endpoints that might not be as practical or implementable. So let's push, if they're going to keep adding things on, let's push for more race ethnicity exploratory endpoints in our protocols too. Like, why not, Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I don't know if it ties to this question, but I mean,
we're just talking.
It's a conversation. It all adds up to the cognitive load on the study team side too. I was literally speaking with a coordinator, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and she had counted the systems she used to manage her trials, and it was 36. Wow. I don't know how anyone can do this.
No one.
And staying, responding coherent to like potential participant, building that trust, lowering the barriers, being responsive, all that thing. How can you keep track of that? And it's tough because a site deals with multiple sponsors, then the sponsors have each their CROs, then the CROs and all have their systems, and it just becomes a very, very complex or maze almost, if you will. So.
And that's what I kind of mentioned about burden on sites. It's that kind of stuff, right? And you also think about it, like sometimes they can't even use the same laptops, iPads for the same studies. They have to have separate iPads for each thing, so it becomes burdensome for these sites that have the patient populations we are looking for that don't have the resources to support all this. I also remembered my other thing.
Go ahead.
Copy and pasting from from eligibility criteria really impacts our LGBTQIA community more than we actually realize. Because oftentimes it is around HIV, it is around Hep B, Hep C. Those are typically, it's around, lab viral loads. Those are typically the inclusions that get copied and pasted. And that just has an impact on our LGBTQIA community. So acknowledging that and not saying, obviously all within scientific rationale and reasoning, but is there a reason why they can't have HIV, or is there something that you can put in around their viral load expectation as opposed to just HIV positive, right? Let's just be more specific around our eligibility criteria as opposed to the copy paste that's truly impacting that community.
I'm glad you brought that example, because we actually recently also had a related question that was asked of us that we haven't really thought about, but it's how implicit bias is built into our protocols that exclude certain patients that we weren't even conscious of. And so, like I'll hear what I'm going to say. So we had a prostate cancer program, and what is the first thing on inclusion criteria on prostate cancer? Just shout it out. You have to be
A male.
male, right? If you press the male button on your most EHR, you're already excluding all the transgender female patients that have a prostate that can develop prostate cancer. And so we actually have, conversations, and we have read this report that came out of the VA that has a case series describing prostate cancer diagnosis disparities in the transgender female population. And so, those are the things that, of course, like you have a prostate cancer trial, the first thing you said is male. But then, how about people with prostates? Ways that we can be more inclusive of more patients. And those are the things that, the person who wrote that protocol probably doesn't think that they're being discriminatory. But these are the ways that implicit bias and subconscious bias can, really infiltrate into like any protocol that we write, so that we need to be more mindful of being inclusive of all patients' experiences.
Thank you. When I think, this has been rich. Two big topics to sort of get us kicked off with. When I think about clinical trial design, as a registered nurse, executive leader who has worked in hospital operations for 38 years, primarily, I think about the practice and the operations side of clinical trials. And that's certainly the stage that I walked into almost 4 years ago when I took my position at Stanford, when we were having this stark increase of COVID trials, and at the same time oncology, hematology, and bone marrow transplant. And at that time, this was spring 2020, our system actually, collapsed, if you will, on the practice side, because we didn't have enough workforce to support all of the trials that were being implemented. So I wonder if, and you mentioned this, Lloryn, the burden on the sites. I wonder what the health services role and responsibility is in partnering with academic research institutions to ensure that we are putting thoughtfulness into what the patient's experience is when they're enrolled in a trial. What our role is to ensure that we're partnering around inclusivity and so forth. So I just put that out there, not necessarily to answer that question, but I think that there is a role of the healthcare system to play a part in the design of the trial from the practice and the operations standpoint. The question that I have, so the follow-up question is, when we think about current trials and historic, where obviously underrepresented groups were not included, are not included, how do we then ensure that as we move forward, that data is generalizable to populations? How do we share that with people who've been excluded now? What does that look like?
Who's
It's
gonna
a
take
complex question.
Yeah.
I think we touched on a lot of them already, and I would say one thing that we are doing right now at Regeneron that is maybe different, that we kind of touched on earlier when we talk about workforce diversity. And obviously not the beyond end all to solve the entire problem, but one of the things that we realize, and I think when the speakers alluded to workforce diversity, The way that we interpret it is, as a company, just like Stanford, Regeneron, any company, we have internal mandates on how we want our workforce to be diverse, we want it to be inclusive, equitable, and all of that. But, to what end? Why are we doing that? And so what we're now interpreting is, we want to make sure that, we are inclusive of our diverse workforce to inform us how to do better science to address all of our patients' needs. And some examples are, in Stanford here, you may have it too, or other organizations that you work at, employee resource groups. And so our employee resource groups are, we have 10 of them now, represent different interests, background of our employees, coming from different, let's say, racial ethnic backgrounds. So we have, and I'm wearing my other hat now, I actually happen to be one of our company's Asian Pacific Islander Employee Resource Group co-chairs, but we have it for, all of our colleagues identifying different groups, disability, LGBTQ, so on and so forth. And so, historically, I think ERGs have been looked upon as party planners. We celebrate, different holidays. We do Black History Month celebrations. And so, but then, taking it a step further, we hear from, our members that, okay, I'm Chinese, I'm Vietnamese, I speak a different language. How can I help my company actually do better when we provide our clinical trials and our medicines to our patients? So one of the example is, one of my favorite examples, we translate, all of our patient-facing material into different languages depending on the program, the intended population. We hire, a accredited translation agency to do that. It comes back with a certificate saying that it's been back translated, it's all good. I don't know how many of you have, if you speak a different language, has sat in the doctor's office, read a different your language material, and you want to laugh or cringe, I think I know what they're trying to say, but I would never say that. Mm-hmm. And so that's how, our employee resource group members were really able to help our clinical research program. So we did a pilot collaboration last year. So our clinical research colleagues did a very ambitious global patient survey to look at patients' needs and assess their preferences in clinical research to understand, their needs. So we did it in 6 languages in 9 different countries. One of them is Chinese, and so, our API ERG partnered with them because we have members that are, in the lab, they're in bench science, they are attorneys, they are, accountants. They would never, interact with patients, but they speak the language, they're in the culture. So they look at the survey, and this one question in English asks, what is, the criteria that you use when you choose a provider who would make you feel comfortable doing clinical research with? And one of the answer options says, my doctor is sensitive to me, as in my doctor is sensitive to my needs. In Chinese, it got translated to my doctor is allergic to me. And in Chinese, it's the same word, but in a different context, right? So, of course, an in-language person would pick it up right away. But then, in a literal translation process, it didn't get picked up. So these are some of the things that, this is just one example. I just remember it because it's funny. But then there's so many examples that we can leverage our own diversity in our company to help us do better in connecting. Like we talk about building relationship with the community. That's one example. Our Black Employee Resource Group has been instrumental in helping us build relationship with fraternities, sororities, different community groups, civic organizations, so that it's not just us as an outsider going in, but we're leveraging our own connections to facilitate these relationships. And it also, I must say, feels good for the employee that's doing that, because we hear from our members that they're in a position that will never, be in a patient-facing, function, but for them to know, for me to know Regeneron is doing this for my family, my people, it feels good. It feels good that I'm able to contribute to that. So I think that, internally, it's also really good, for, our own colleagues to know that they can participate in that. So that's just one example. Obviously not going to solve the entire problem, but.
Go ahead.
Still, one thing about that, okay, it's cringe, the translation was all weird, but still it was translated, so it still gets received. It's something that we, encounter sometimes, trying to push, the envelope a little bit on study content and things like that. How about machine translation? How about using some more of the latest technologies in AI, LLM, things like that? Yeah. Can we, okay, maybe it's not going to be 100% perfect, but the certified translation apparently isn't perfect either. So it's still you're still trying to reach out, and I think it's better than not do it.
I agree. I think it is easy. I think it is better to reach out than not. However, oftentimes, if you read something that is in your native language that is not applicable, it is a turnoff. It will be more of a barrier, you know? So I do think we need to be sensitive to those things. And maybe even just some guidance to the site around the translation and kind of explaining to the patient when the patient is, you know, in front of the coordinator or whoever, like, this translation might not be exactly right, please ask me any questions. Even that is going to be considerably helpful. From my perspective, just getting back to your initial question around data, I think we are really struggling as an industry with this data. I don't think we collect it well, if we even collect it at all. From the CRO perspective, we work with a ton of sponsors, a ton of clients that collect this all in their own way. And the ability to leverage that data is really tough because of privacy, because it belongs to the client. So we don't have the ability to say, okay, we have all this data as a CRO, we're gonna pull it together and look at what our race ethnicity looks like across studies. We technically can't do that because the data doesn't belong to us. And so really, I'm kind of advocating for us to be open to sharing more data within the constructs of, obviously, data privacy law. But I do think that is going to be something we have to really consider moving forward as an industry, because right now we just don't have enough of the data without paywalls, without privacy issues, without ownership issues, for us to really take a step back and look at what all of this data is going to say about our clinical trials in the next 5 to 10 years. I think we're all collecting it very individually right now, which is just a challenge. So that would be my main thing around what's our barrier right now, is the fact that everybody's collecting this in a different way, and maybe not in a different way, but on a different platform. Let me be clear. I think everybody's using CDISC, but we're not using the same platforms. We're not using the same, I'm not a biostatistician, but you know what I mean? Like,
interoperability?
There you go. Yeah. Come on through with those words. We're not using any of that.
Don't get us started. Yeah, the technology is definitely a barrier.
Yeah.
It's hard to use. Sometimes we work with teams and it's like, okay, can you open this on your mobile phone? And that's not always a yes, or it kind of like shows wonky. If you're going to introduce someone to something they've never done before, and then the first thing is like a survey that kind of is a little wonky, yeah, it's not going to work.
Yeah. Or even just like when we're collecting the data in the EMR or this like CRFs, ECRFs, like that pool is also very challenging across sponsors, because every sponsor is using a different platform, right? And that pulls out into our data sets completely differently as well. And so being able to actually analyze that data in a way that is, I think, substantial for all of us to benefit from is not happening.
Yeah, the FDA recently, to illustrate that point, they issued this health data challenge. And so even though the OMB has clearly stated, you know, these are the standards, but even then there are two, right? There is the one that you ask ethnicity first, you know, Hispanic or Latino or not, and then you go into the races, and now there's a different way that you can roll them all into 6 different groups all at the same time. So there's that. And then, you know, to your point, not just sponsors, but in the healthcare ecosystem, different academic centers, different hospitals, different payers, different systems, you know, all use different ways to collect these data. So technologically, how do you, you know, reconcile with all of that? And so there are technologies, I think, like to your point, there are technologies that are better now. Actually, Regeneron issued one of the responses, and we're one of the top performers in that challenge. It involves really complex coding that I don't understand, but it's a way to reconcile the data. But we're still a long ways from being able to make sense of the vast, flawed, real data that we have. And to your point about CDISC, even though it's a standard, we still get challenges from people like, why do you have this? We internally just got one from a study team member that was very upset that there is a category, the name of the group is Southern African Colored. She's like, what day and age is this? Why is colored in your CDISC library?
I was just going to say, we haven't even talked about global ethnicity at this point.
And so, so anyway, it's a long story, but the interpretation in South Africa is different. So South African colored is actually a mixed ancestry, whereas in the Western world is completely different. So even just dealing with standardized library, you still have so much different room to interpret. So we cannot solve this problem.
And to be completely honest, this data wasn't important to us until 2019. So even if we collected it in a demographic, CRF, or we collected it in some form from, I don't know, maybe your lab values or whatever, it wasn't being captured, it wasn't being saved, it wasn't being leveraged for anything for us to improve our clinical trials, right? So it's also that mindset shift about actually capturing this data in a way where we can leverage it to improve what we're doing.
All right. No, rich discussion. We've moved from clinical trial design into community engagement. And what I'd like to do is just close this out with one question regarding geographic decentralization of clinical trials and the effect that that will have on engagement of communities of color in particular. Just want to point out that earlier we heard from Dr. Barbara Ear that cost and accommodations, trial burden, and operations are critical things for us to think about. So how might decentralization address some of those issues?
Who's going? So, I mean, I think, so we were struggling with running studies at the site. Now we're decentralizing, so we were adding extra complexity to the system. So the fragility, it becomes a very fragile operation, right? You change one thing, one amendment in the protocol, and it just like a knock-on effect down the line, and all sorts of stuff goes wrong. Plus you need then the right mobile apps and the things, sometimes it doesn't talk to each other. So how can we build almost resiliency within the design and in the set of tools that teams have to communicate and provide a consumer-like experience, right? With enough like fallbacks if things don't work out the way it is. Like I heard earlier, like what about people who don't have access to the latest tools or don't like to use it? So how do you accommodate for offline and online, like hybrid approaches while being decentralized? I mean, these are, I think very important things to think through and do a couple dry runs and see if it all adds up, and then put it in the real world and start collecting data on the operations itself. Because sometimes, the study app is there, everything's there, the consent, and it seems on paper it's going to work out, and then in real world data, right? it shows that it kind of like falls apart. So where is the resiliency, and how can you kind of recover from that? I think it's important.
There's definitely a process of trial and error. I think, during the pandemic, we realized that back then there was a definite need, right, for decentralized trial or virtual trials. And now, just like, in our real lives and work, you realize that there's some work you need to do in person. There is some work that you can do virtually, right? So that's what we're trying to figure out now in clinical trials. Where would it be smart and wise to do some of the components of the research virtually, where some of the steps still have to be done in person, especially as we're talking about mistrust, building relationships. You cannot completely forego the interpersonal interactions. But like technology these days, really allow us to do a lot more, but with caveats, right? So we talk about AI, the ability to turn vast quantities of data to help us, be more efficient. But I think you mentioned earlier that in translations, how do we use AI to large language models to process the data, and the input, is it actually applicable? I mean, if the input is not representative of all patients, then the output is not. So we just have to be really careful and be mindful of the limitations as we use technology, but it's inevitable, we have to. But in the process of, there is still going to be some trial and errors.
There's limitation to pen and paper too, and binders. So
it's like 30 years ago, right? Like when we're like first hearing about the concept of the internet. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's kind of like where we are now. Like it's inevitable. It's coming. We have to be smart about developing and using it the right way. It's where we are right now, and trying to figure out how do you be as smart about it as possible?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we have more tech literacy in the future. I think we talk about a lot of health literacy that is more around our language in materials, but tech literacy is just as important if we're going to continue to move towards more decentralized trial tactics. Because I hear a ton of stories from sites all the time around elderly patients that just end up coming to the site anyway. Like, I don't know how to use this thing, so I'm just here at the site and you just walk me through it. It defeats the purpose of that, So, we hear that a lot. We hear, oh, well, my internet's been out for 2 months just because I couldn't afford it, so I had to go to the Starbucks to get on their Wi-Fi to do my daily thing, and then I was out of the window because I missed my window for the daily diary, but I just didn't have internet. There's those kind of things, right? So we see the pros and the cons, but we also, I think that tech literacy and all of the, again, kind of barriers around access, I need more of those conversations to be happening.
All right. Well, I want to take a moment to thank our panel for a rich conversation across several different topical areas and answering and building on many of the questions that we talked about today. So I'd like to open up for any questions and feedback that you might have for our panel members. So again, we have 2 mics on either side of the room. Please do feel free to come up and we'll take your questions.
Thank you. That was really wonderful, wonderful panel. Thank you. So I have a provocative question, a difficult one. So our objective is to increase diversity, obviously, in our clinical trials. But at the same time, we don't have a very robust way to come back to participants and say, we've determined that this is safe and effective for you. In fact, the whole issue of drug dosing, we kind of said, well, early trials, yeah, but that's when you often determine the drug dosing. So how can we go back and really tell participants, yeah, you participated, but we really can't tell you whether this is safe, and we're going to kind of ignore you as a group because you're just not enough of you. And there's this whole statistical problem, right? So trials are so expensive already. We can't expect trials to achieve statistical significance in looking at a subgroup. But at the same time, we obviously want participants to get the feedback that, yes, this is safe and effective for me. So I don't know, thoughts about how to deal with that dilemma that's facing us.
I'm going to look at the sponsor.
No, that is a big question. I'm curious to hear your thoughts too. I love to hear from your perspective as a site, because to your question earlier, how do you make sure that we're engaging them in patients in a meaningful way? And meaningful not just to science, but meaningful to the community as well, right? So, if I participate in the clinical trials, I gave my time, I was compensated. But, I really gave my time because, we know that the altruistic spirit is the reason why a lot of our patients participated. They want to know if it works for me, my family, people like me. And so, and then there are times that, the study would not be unblinded, for months, years. And so, this is something that we talk about a lot. How do we bring back the study results in a meaningful way to our patients? Maybe not specific to a particular study and particular to a specific person, but can we come back to the community? Let's say we're building relationship in the Black community. When we do the trial, can we go back to that community, the church, the fraternity, sorority, and just talk about the disease? And the new knowledge that we have. And so it may not be specific to one study and one patient, but at least they know that these are the medical advances that happened in the last few years. And then, these are the trials that, that helped us better understand, how this medication work in this, patient community. And so even though not directly addressing that, it's kind of to my point earlier, not just come to them when you need something, but, when you have new information to share, come back to share that too. And, that could help hopefully build on that trust. And then going forward, then there's going to be a more trusting relationship to continue on these research, so that people feel like there's more of a purpose and a meaning and ownership of what they participated in. But it's not a perfect answer. We love to hear more about how you guys want to do that too.
I would propose that at the front end, we do need to be more intentional about doing some certainly safety work with the different groups, I would say. And then probably the back end, that is post-market approval, probably to have more specific studies that are intentional around subgroups.
right?
Thank
Phase 4 studies, registries, and global patient safety surveillance. Those are all those different ways that we try to gather those real-world experience.
I think from a patient perspective, when I've talked to patients about this, what we hear is that making those long-term follow-up visits, not in person, but like talking to someone instead of it just being like check boxes on a form or, they're lost to follow up because you can't get a hold of them maybe once or twice. Like those actually are meaningful opportunities to hold conversations around, hey, we might not have a lot of data back from the sponsor yet, or hey, we still appreciate you being a participant. Even little things like that. I had a patient, she was at Society for Clinical Research Sites. She presented around how even just thank you cards, how birthday cards from their clinical trial site, not their primary care provider, meant a lot to her, because it's like, oh, they still value me as a human. And so then she was more engaged to follow up, and the site was more responsive to that. So I think even the little things that we're not also like always thinking about do have an impact on that, even though, yeah, I think there's still a lot of limitations around what can be shared. I think I would love, obviously, more transparency around what we can share from the data perspective. But until then, thinking about these patients as humans and acknowledging that some of them are in follow-up for 2 years after they're done with their actual treatment, trying to leverage those visits to be sincere visits is, yeah.
The only thing that I would add to that is, and to your point, the upfront part, I would say community education. So going out and talking about, what are the goals of research? What is this study? I think generally speaking, people who participate in studies are looking for a certain outcome for themselves. So I think just setting that expectation up front, like, why are we even doing this? So I would just add that to what you mentioned. Other questions?
Yeah, hi, thank you guys for your panel. I had a question about the incorporation of race and how that's interpreted in terms of the meeting. And so, we say race is a social construct, and then there's race and there's racism, and then we're having this charge to include race, but then that interpretation of race of what I've been seeing is that some people use that then to further promote a biological determinism of that's why the race was included. But that's, from all the talks today and from what we know, that's not the purpose. And so my question is more, how do you balance and how do you communicate, like, yes, we're including race because we want diversity to speak to different community experiences, but we still believe that race is a social construct.
Great questions. I'll just... So we can talk about this for another hour, probably.
Yeah.
But quickly, I think, the point is well taken. Race, as we just take the FDA OMB definition, is, the 6 groups. It's an arbitrary social construct for a variety of reasons. And so that's what we have to abide by as we report our data, to FDA OMB standards. But it is true that, in a lot of cases, race as defined, in these terms are misleading. And so I was working at Sanofi at this time, like 20 plus years ago, when Plavix, a lot of you in cardiovascular medicine remember this, where the data in Asians, in the early stages of the program, when the drug was approved, well, first of all, Asian is a small group, and so we didn't really see any signal, and it was like, oh, it works, it's safe. But then, as it was used more broadly in the community, we realized that East Asian and South Asian respond very differently. And there are like, under-metabolizers that actually were more prone to bleeding, more common in South Asian populations, whereas, the opposite happens more in East Asian population where the drug just does not work as well, and Pacific Islanders as well. So it's not useful lumping all these patients together as one race, as Asian, and you are really diluting the nuances within the one population. So by reporting standard, we have to report to race, and that's how we do our clinical trials. But beyond the requirements, can we be more mindful of, understanding the ancestral lineages of, different subpopulations, and really looking at it in a more scientific way beyond, how race is defined, in the way that we are required to report. And balancing those two, like you said, and understanding the requirements, and then there is what we really need to do to understand the underlying biology and science behind these differences.
So you would work with maybe biomarkers instead
Yeah, I mean, and genetics and biomarkers, again, you know, the data, we can talk about it again for another half an hour. But, you know, we know now, right, the available genetic data that we have, 80% of them come from the 20% of European ancestry population around the world. So it is useful, but also has caveats, right? So,
For sure.
so it's, nothing is perfect, you know, we just have to understand the limitations of all the information that's available to us and apply them accordingly.
Yeah, within GWAS, I think it's like, it is 98% of the data is from European ancestry, but then I think it's like 70% of that is just US.
Yeah.
It's not even diverse within global European ancestry. So we do have to be careful when we start going down that avenue. But yeah, we could talk about that all day, about how that probably is obviously like another approach.
Right, thank you. Another question?
I just want to thank you for just dealing with the reality of dealing with people. They're all human people, and being kind to them and understanding. I have two important points. I know we have to have an IRB for approval of a study, and sometimes we have to look at the IRB at a multi-site level. But sometimes when we are more specific with our own populations, maybe we need to look at the IRB. Is this general IRB going to really meet our qualifications here? Because maybe something in New York, Chicago, Florida, and they always want to include California as a site, could be an issue. And then that some of our patients really can get out of the study at any time. I think we need to be supportive with that, be real, like be in person some of the time, and some like choose our method, our methodology. And I think third, which I haven't seen with the research I've done in the past, is that there's follow-up with the results for the people, because that is not done. And I just want to say, can we do that better? Because I participated in research, I've done research, but you know, some of the studies that I've been involved in, I haven't heard what's going on. So it's sort of lost. So I just, if we can do that better, and I know that you're real people up there wanting to make that happen. So yay.
Thank you. You're 100% right. I think we can totally do it better, by the way. We just don't, because it, you know, one, well, actually, let me stop.
Thank you for sharing those 2 points with us. We really appreciate them. So we have time for 2 more quick points,
Great
questions.
discussion so far. I know we have to do a lot of work and we're just getting started. And one of the points that you discussed or we're talking about was think about it early on when we are thinking about developing protocols and incorporating a budget. I think from that perspective, when we're thinking about making a budget and really think about diversity and inclusion, what is the one thing or a few things that we're like, you know, thinking about when we are, our goal is to increase diversity? What would be your recommendation when, what should we be accounting that budget for? Would it be like a patient navigator or like some other intervention that you may have like come across to really have the most impact?
Yeah, I think patient navigator is one that we don't consider as a cost. I think community engagement, people think it's free, it's not. So really thinking about how we can support at a site level community engagement, and maybe, you know, more sustainably, if you were thinking about working with one organization, introduce that organization maybe a year before you actually start the protocol. That is budget. You have to consider these things. So those would be my main things, are more around community engagement. I just don't know why we think it's free or why it's low cost. It's not, right? We have people, boots on the ground, doing this work. Those people need to get paid. So thinking about that in our budgets would be one strong one.
Thank you.
Hello. That was loud, sorry. My name is Fred Stevenson. I work at UC Davis, and I've been knowing Michelle for a really long time. Long time. So in my position, I work in clinical trials recruitment at UC Davis, and probably been working also in IT. I was a programmer for Epic, and I'm also a provider. But when I started this role, one of the things I wanted to do was make friends. I made friends with IRB, compliance and privacy, But more importantly, I made him friends with public affairs and marketing, because I wanted to understand how is it that this population can be so engaged in social media, in Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, right? And that cuts across all barriers. We have every ethnic group you can think of that can engage in social media. And I wanted to know how or why they do it. And so here are some of the stats that they gave me. And these are just basic social media marketing stats. Is that over 95% of the US population owns a cell phone. And that 90% of text messages are read within 3 minutes. On an average, it takes 90 minutes to obtain a response to an email, but it takes 90 seconds to respond to a text. Just let that sink in. That's about an 8 times higher response rate, or 6,000% communication productivity. So we've been looking at how can we utilize texting, which is now Generation Y and Z and Alpha's response, because you cannot get Generation Y and Z and Alpha, especially if that's in your catchment area, you cannot get them to respond to a phone call. It just won't do it. So we have to think about the communication preference of the generation we want to reach, which is it phone call? Is it voicemails? Is it emails? Is it texting? Whatever that is, we need to find that multi-pronged approach to finding those folks, because social media is finding them, and we need to find what methods or utilize those same methods to approach people. So.
Thank you, Fred. Great points. All right. Well, we want to thank you so much for this opportunity to have this conversation with you, and we really appreciate your feedback and your questions. Thank you.